The antelope's mother lay dead in the ravine, and Clara Bennett knew she had about 2 hours before the orphaned fawn would perish from dehydration under the merciless Arizona sun of 1882. She had been riding back to her homestead outside of Prescott when she heard the bleating, a sound so desperate and small that it cut through the afternoon heat like a knife. Clara dismounted quickly, her boots sending up puffs of red dust as she scrambled down the rocky slope. The baby antelope couldn't have been more than a few days old, its legs wobbly and uncertain, its dark eyes wide with fear as it nuzzled against its mother's still form. A cougar had gotten to the doe, that much was clear from the claw marks, but something must have scared the predator off before it could finish its meal or notice the fawn hidden in the brush. Clara approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. She had grown up on this land, the daughter of a veterinarian who had moved west after the Civil War seeking a fresh start and found it in the Arizona Territory. Her father had died 3 years ago, leaving her the homestead and everything he had taught her about healing animals. At 24, Clara lived alone, managing the small ranch and taking in injured creatures when she could, though she had never attempted to save something this young and fragile. The fawn didn't run when she reached for it. It was too weak, too desperate for any form of comfort. Clara wrapped it carefully in her riding jacket, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against her chest as she carried it up the slope. The animal was severely dehydrated, its gums pale, its body temperature too high. She secured it as gently as possible in front of her saddle and urged her mare into a steady trot toward home. The ride back took 40 minutes, and Clara spent every second of it talking to the little creature, telling it stories about her father, about the land, about anything that came to mind. She needed it to stay conscious, to keep fighting. By the time she reached her property, a modest spread of 30 acres with a small house, a barn, and a chicken coop, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Clara carried the fawn into her kitchen and laid it on a pile of clean blankets near the stove. She had goat's milk, thank goodness, from the 2 nanny goats she kept for exactly this purpose. Her father had always said that goat's milk was the closest thing to deer milk you could find. She warmed it carefully, testing the temperature on her wrist the way her father had shown her, then filled a glass bottle with a rubber nipple she had fashioned from materials at the general store. The fawn was reluctant at first, turning its head away, but Clara was patient. She dipped her finger in the milk and let the animal taste it, and after a few attempts, the fawn latched onto the bottle and began to drink. Relief flooded through Clara so powerfully that she felt tears spring to her eyes. This was the first hurdle, but there would be many more. She spent the rest of the evening tending to the animal, checking it every hour, offering water, keeping it warm. The fawn's condition stabilized somewhat, but Clara knew the real challenge lay ahead. It would need constant care, frequent feedings, protection from predators, and a safe space to begin moving around as it grew stronger. Her kitchen was no place for a wild animal beyond the first critical night. She dozed in a chair beside the fawn, starting awake each time it stirred or made a sound. By dawn, she was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The animal had made it through the night and its eyes seemed brighter, more alert. She fed it again, and this time it drank with more enthusiasm. Clara was outside examining the area beside her barn, trying to determine the best location for some kind of enclosure, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She turned to see a rider approaching from the east, silhouetted against the morning sun. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle she kept near the door, but as the rider drew closer, she recognized him. James Holloway was a cowboy who worked at the large cattle ranch about 5 miles north of her property. She had seen him in town a handful of times over the past year, always polite, always keeping a respectful distance. He was probably 26 or 27, tall and lean with dark hair and darker eyes, the kind of man who seemed completely at ease on horseback. Clara had noticed him noticing her on more than one occasion, but neither of them had ever exchanged more than pleasantries. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from where she stood and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Miss Bennett. Hope I am not intruding." "Morning, Mr. Holloway." Clara shielded her eyes against the sun. "What brings you out this way?" "I was riding fence line for the ranch and saw buzzards circling over the ravine yesterday evening. Went to investigate this morning and found a dead doe. Saw tracks indicating someone had been there, leading back this direction. Wanted to make sure everything was all right out here." His voice was deep and calm, the kind of voice that could settle a spooked horse. Clara felt herself soften slightly. It was considerate of him to check, even if it was technically outside the boundaries of the ranch where he worked. "I found her yesterday afternoon. There was a fawn, just a baby. I brought it back here. It is in rough shape, but I think it might survive if I can give it proper care." James's expression shifted to one of genuine interest. He dismounted and walked closer, moving with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. "A baby antelope. That is ambitious. They are delicate creatures." "I know," Clara said, feeling suddenly defensive. "My father was a veterinarian. I have some experience with this sort of thing." "I did not mean any offense," James said quickly, holding up his hands. "I think it is admirable. I just meant that you will have your work cut out for you. May I see it?" Clara hesitated for only a moment before nodding and leading him toward the house. The fawn was still resting on the blankets, though it lifted its head when they entered. James crouched down slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. "Poor little thing, it is lucky you found it." "Lucky we both did not arrive a few hours later," Clara corrected. She found herself watching the way James's hands moved, careful and confident, as he let the fawn sniff his fingers. There was something about the gesture that spoke of genuine kindness. "You are going to need a pen for it," James observed, standing up. "Somewhere it can be safe from predators but still get used to being outdoors. Antelope need space to move, even the young ones, or their legs will not develop properly." "I was just trying to figure out where to build something when you rode up," Clara admitted. "I am not much of a carpenter, but I will manage." James looked at her for a long moment, and Clara found herself unable to look away. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the dim light of the kitchen, and there was an openness in his expression that she had not expected. "I could build it for you," he said finally. "I have experience with that kind of work, and I have some free time this week. The ranch boss gave me a few days off since we just finished a big drive." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She was used to managing on her own, used to not needing help from anyone. But the truth was that she had no idea how to build a proper enclosure, and the fawn needed one soon. Pride seemed like a foolish thing to cling to when a life was at stake. "I would appreciate that," she said, the words coming out more formal than she intended. "I cannot pay much, but I could offer meals and whatever else I can manage." "I am not asking for payment," James said. "I am offering because it is the right thing to do. That little one deserves a fighting chance." Something in Clara's chest tightened at his words. She had been alone for so long, handling everything by herself, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply offer help without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That is very kind." James smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more relaxed. "I will ride back to the ranch and get some supplies. I should be back by early afternoon. In the meantime, keep doing what you are doing with the feedings. Every few hours, right?" "Every 3 hours," Clara confirmed. "I warmed some goat's milk for it this morning." "That is perfect. You are doing everything right." James tipped his hat to her and headed back outside. Clara followed, watching as he mounted his horse with fluid ease. "I will see you soon, Miss Bennett." "Clara," she said impulsively. "You can call me Clara if you are going to be working here." His smile widened. "James, then, no need for formalities." She watched him ride away, feeling something unfamiliar stirring inside her. It was not just gratitude, though there was certainly that. It was something else. Something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She shook her head, dismissing the thought, and went back inside to check on the fawn. True to his word, James returned in the early afternoon with a wagon full of lumber, posts, wire fencing, and tools. Clara had just finished another feeding, and the fawn was showing even more improvement, actually attempting to stand on its shaky legs. She stepped outside to meet James as he began unloading materials. "Where do you think would be the best spot?" he asked, surveying the area. Clara pointed to a flat section of ground near the barn, partially shaded by a large cottonwood tree. "There, I think. It gets shade in the afternoon, and it is close enough to the house that I can keep an eye on things, but far enough that the fawn will not get too accustomed to human presence." "Smart thinking," James approved. He began marking out the dimensions with stakes and string, explaining his plan as he worked. The enclosure would be about 20 feet by 20 feet, large enough for the fawn to move around and exercise its legs, with sturdy posts and wire fencing buried deep enough to prevent predators from digging underneath. He would also build a small shelter in one corner where the animal could escape the elements. Clara found herself drawn into the work, holding posts steady while James hammered them into the ground, passing him tools, fetching water when he needed it. They fell into an easy rhythm, and conversation came naturally. James told her about growing up in Texas, about learning ranch work from his father and uncles, about drifting west after his mother died and finding work in Arizona. His voice carried the weight of loss but also resilience, and Clara understood that particular combination all too well. "What about you?" James asked during a break, wiping sweat from his forehead with his bandana. "How did you end up out here on your own?" Clara handed him a cup of cool water from the well. "My father brought us here after the war. He wanted to start fresh, away from all the memories back east. My mother died when I was young, so it was always just the two of us. He taught me everything he knew about animals and medicine. When he passed, I just continued what we had built together." "That takes courage," James observed. "Living out here alone, some people would have sold the place and moved to town." "Some people did suggest that," Clara said with a wry smile, "but this is my home. My father is buried on that hill over there. I'm not ready to leave him or this place." James nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "Family and land, those are things worth holding on to." They worked through the afternoon, the sun arcing across the bright Arizona sky. Clara went inside every 3 hours to feed the fawn, and each time she returned, the pen had taken more shape. James worked with the kind of focused efficiency that spoke of years of experience, but he was never rushed, never careless. Everything he did was measured and deliberate, built to last. By evening, the frame of the pen was complete, and James had started attaching the wire fencing. Clara insisted he stay for supper, and he accepted with a graciousness that suggested he was genuinely pleased by the invitation rather than just being polite. She prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and salt pork, along with vegetables from her garden. They ate at her small kitchen table while the fawn dozed nearby, both of them too tired and hungry for much conversation at first. "This is excellent," James said after a few bites. "I have been eating my own cooking for too long. This is a real treat." "It is nothing fancy," Clara said, but she was pleased nonetheless. "Just plain food." "Plain food made with care tastes better than fancy food made without it," James replied. He glanced over at the fawn. "How is our patient doing?" "Stronger every hour," Clara said, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "I think we really might pull this off." "We," James repeated, and there was something warm in the way he said it that made Clara's heart skip slightly. "I like that." After supper, James insisted on helping with the dishes despite Clara's protests. They worked side by side at the wash basin, and Clara found herself acutely aware of his presence, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against hers, the sound of his breathing in the quiet house. When the last dish was dried and put away, James retrieved his hat from the peg by the door. "I will be back first thing in the morning to finish the pen," he said. "Should have it done by afternoon." "You have already done so much," Clara said. "I cannot thank you enough." "You do not need to thank me," James said softly. "I am happy to help." He hesitated at the door as if he wanted to say something else, but then simply tipped his hat and stepped out into the gathering darkness. Clara stood in the doorway watching him ride away, the last rays of sunlight painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The fawn made a small sound behind her, and she turned back inside, feeling less alone than she had in years. James arrived at dawn the next morning, and Clara had coffee and breakfast waiting. She had been up since before sunrise, tending to the fawn and preparing food, and she refused to examine too closely why she had taken extra care with her appearance, braiding her hair neatly and wearing her better dress instead of her usual work clothes. If James noticed, he was gentleman enough not to comment, though his smile when he saw her seemed particularly warm. They ate quickly, both eager to get to work, and then James resumed his labor on the pen while Clara tended to her regular chores and the fawn's increasingly frequent demands for attention. The little Antelope was definitely stronger now, able to stand for longer periods and even take a few wobbly steps. Clara felt a surge of pride each time she watched it move. Against considerable odds, they were succeeding. The fawn was going to survive. By midday, the pen was complete. James had even added extra reinforcements and built a clever little shelter with a slanted roof to shed rain. He filled a water trough and spread fresh straw in the sheltered area, creating a comfortable space for the recovering animal. "Let us give it a try," James suggested, and together they carefully carried the fawn outside. The little creature's eyes went wide at the open sky and the scent of fresh air, and for a moment it seemed frightened. But then it took a tentative step, and then another, and soon it was exploring its new home with increasing confidence. Clara laughed with pure delight, clapping her hands together. "Look at it. Oh, look how well it is moving." James was grinning too, clearly pleased with both the pen and the fawn's reaction to it. "It is a tough little thing, just needed someone to give it a chance." They stood side by side watching the fawn for a long time, leaning against the fence rail. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of silence that exists between people who have found an unexpected connection. Finally, Clara turned to James. "I do not know how to properly thank you for all this," she said seriously. "You have been so generous with your time and skills." "I told you I do not need thanks," James said, but his expression had grown more serious too. "But if you want the truth, I am glad I had an excuse to spend time here, to spend time with you." Clara's breath caught. She had suspected he might feel something similar to what she was beginning to feel, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "James, I know I am probably speaking out of turn," he continued, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "And I know we have only just really met. But I have noticed you for months now, Clara. Every time I saw you in town, I wanted to find a reason to talk to you, but I never had the courage. When I found that doe yesterday and saw the tracks leading here, I will admit I was worried. And when I learned you were all right, I was more relieved than I had any right to be for someone I barely knew." Clara's heart was pounding now. She had built walls around herself after her father died, convinced that solitude was easier than risking the pain of losing someone else she cared about. But standing here with James, watching the fawn they had saved together explore its new home, those walls felt less necessary than they once had. "I noticed you too," she admitted quietly. "I just never thought." "What?" James prompted gently. "That anyone would want to take on a woman living alone out here, set in her ways, more comfortable with animals than people most days." Clara tried to smile, but it came out shaky. James reached over and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. "I think you are extraordinary," he said simply. "You are brave and skilled and kind. You saved that fawn's life because you could not stand to see something suffer. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from feeling understood after being alone for so long. "I would like to know you better," she said, "if that is something you want too." "It is all I want," James said, and the honesty in his voice made her believe him. They stood there holding hands while the fawn cavorted in the pen, and Clara felt something shift inside her, some locked door finally opening to let light back in. Over the following weeks, James became a constant presence at Clara's homestead. He would ride over after finishing his work at the ranch, often bringing fresh grass he had cut specifically for the fawn, which was growing stronger and more energetic by the day. The little antelope would run to the fence when it saw James approaching, and he would laugh and scratch behind its ears, marveling at how such a fragile creature had developed into something so vital and alive. But as much as James came to see the antelope, Clara knew he came to see her more. They would work together on various projects around the homestead, fixing a section of roof on the barn, mending fences, tending the garden. James had a way of making even the hardest work feel less burdensome simply by being there, offering his quiet strength and steady presence. In the evenings, they would sit on Clara's porch watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. James told her about his dreams of eventually having his own ranch, a small place where he could raise horses and cattle and build something lasting. Clara shared stories about her father, about growing up learning to set bones and treat illnesses in animals, about the satisfaction of seeing a creature she had helped return to health. "You ever get lonely out here?" James asked one evening as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Clara considered the question carefully. "I did," she said finally, "especially right after my father died, but I convinced myself that being alone was better than risking loss again. Now, though." She trailed off, glancing at him. "Now," James prompted, shifting closer on the porch step so their shoulders touched. "Now I think maybe I was wrong," Clara finished softly. "I think maybe some risks are worth taking." James took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am not going anywhere, Clara. I know it is early to be saying things like this, but I need you to know. I am not the kind of man who does things halfway. When I commit to something, to someone, I am all in." Clara turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity written plainly across his features. In the fading light, he looked almost unbearably dear to her, this man who had come into her life over a dying fawn and stayed because he wanted to know her, truly know her. "I believe you," she said, "and for what it is worth, I am not the kind of woman who does things halfway either." James leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Clara did not want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the connection that had been growing between them since that first morning when he rode up asking if everything was all right. When his lips met hers, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something that had been waiting to happen since the moment they met. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it deepened as Clara leaned into him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and James rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he whispered. "I probably have been since I saw you standing in your yard that first morning, looking like you were ready to take on the world for that baby antelope." "I am falling in love with you too," Clara whispered back, and saying the words aloud felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. The summer months passed in a golden haze of work and courtship and quiet moments of connection. The fawn continued to thrive, growing from a wobbly baby into a graceful juvenile with a spotted coat and increasingly confident movements. Clara knew that eventually she would need to release it back into the wild, but for now it was safe and healthy, and that was enough. James had started talking to his boss at the ranch about opportunities for advancement, making it clear that he intended to stay in the area permanently. The ranch owner, a shrewd man named Thompson who had known Clara's father, approved of the relationship and even offered James a small parcel of land adjacent to Clara's property as part of his wages. It was not much, but it was a start, a foundation on which to build something real. One evening in late August, As they sat on the porch watching the antelope graze on the fresh grass James had brought that morning, he turned to Clara with an expression of nervous determination. "I know this might seem rushed," he began, "and I know by some standards we have not known each other that long, but I also know my own heart and I know what I want. Clara Bennett, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Clara's breath caught, but there was no hesitation in her response. "Yes," she said, the word coming out fierce and certain. "Yes, absolutely yes." James pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy and grounded all at once. When they broke apart, both of them were laughing, giddy with the enormity of what they had just committed to. "I do not have a ring yet," James admitted, "but I will get you one, I promise." "I do not need a ring," Clara said, "I just need you." They were married in September in a small ceremony at the church in Prescott, with a handful of friends from town and some of James's colleagues from the ranch in attendance. Clara wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, and James wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed until they were nearly stiff. Thompson, the ranch owner, stood up as James's witness, and the wife of the general store owner stood up for Clara. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Clara with such tenderness that several people in attendance dabbed at their eyes. Afterward, there was a modest celebration at Clara's homestead, which was now their homestead, with food and music and dancing under the stars. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Clara and James stood together by the antelope's pen. The animal, now nearly full-grown, watched them with its large, intelligent eyes, chewing contentedly on a mouthful of grass. "We saved it," Clara said softly, leaning against her husband's side. "Against all the odds, we saved it." "We saved each other," James corrected, wrapping his arm around her waist. "That fawn just gave us an excuse to find what we were both looking for." Clara tilted her face up to kiss him, tasting the truth in his words. They had found each other through an act of compassion, and that compassion had blossomed into something neither of them had expected but both of them needed. The first year of their marriage was filled with hard work and harder-won victories. James continued working at the ranch while also helping Clara expand their homestead operations. They built additional enclosures for injured animals that Clara took in, creating a small sanctuary for creatures that needed temporary care. Word spread through the area about Clara's skills, and people began bringing her injured livestock and wild animals, knowing she would do everything in her power to help. James proved to be not only a devoted husband but also a skilled partner in the rehabilitation work. He had a natural gentleness with animals that complemented Clara's medical knowledge, and together they made an excellent team. He would build the enclosures and gather food while Clara handled the medical treatments and feeding schedules. In the spring, they released the antelope back into the wild. It was a bittersweet moment, watching the creature that had brought them together bound away into the hills, but it was also deeply satisfying. The animal was healthy and strong, capable of surviving on its own. That had been the goal all along. "Do you think we will see it again?" Clara asked, watching the antelope disappear into the distance. "Maybe," James said, "but even if we do not, we will always know we gave it a chance. That is what matters." Clara discovered she was pregnant in June, and the news filled both of them with a joy so profound it was almost frightening. James became even more protective and attentive, constantly worried about Clara overexerting herself. She tolerated his concern with amused patience, reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her work while pregnant. Their son was born in February of 1884, a healthy baby boy with James's dark hair and Clara's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after Clara's father, and from the moment James held his son for the first time, Clara knew that her husband had found another piece of what he had been searching for his whole life. Samuel grew up surrounded by animals and open spaces, learning from both his parents about the importance of compassion and hard work. James eventually saved enough to buy additional land, expanding their property into a proper ranch. He raised horses, breeding them carefully and developing a reputation for quality stock. Clara continued her animal rehabilitation work, and their home became known throughout the territory as a place where injured creatures could find help. 2 years after Samuel was born, they had a daughter they named Rose. She had Clara's red gold hair and James's dark eyes, and she was as fierce and independent as her mother from the very beginning. The children grew up helping with the animals, learning to ride almost before they could walk, understanding instinctively that living things deserved care and respect. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep and the work was done, Clara and James would still sit on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they would see antelope grazing in the distance, and they would wonder if one of them might be the fawn they had saved all those years ago. Whether it was or not did not really matter. What mattered was that they had built a life together based on the same principles that had brought them together in the first place: kindness, determination, and the belief that every life was worth fighting for. Do you ever regret it? James asked one evening, his arm around Clara's shoulders as they watched their children play in the yard. Taking in that fawn, I mean, it changed everything. Clara leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sunshine that always clung to him. Not for a single moment, she said. That fawn gave us this family, this life. How could I possibly regret that? I used to think I was just drifting, James said thoughtfully. Moving from place to place, never really finding where I belonged. Then I rode up to your property that morning and everything suddenly made sense. I had been looking for you without even knowing it. We found each other, Clara said, turning to kiss him. That is all that matters. As the years passed, their ranch prospered and their children grew strong and capable. Samuel developed his father's skill with horses, eventually taking over much of the breeding program. Rose inherited her mother's gift for healing, spending hours learning everything Clara could teach her about treating sick and injured animals. They added more children to their family, another daughter named Grace, and then twin boys, Jack and William, who kept everyone on their toes with their boundless energy and mischief. The property expanded until it encompassed over 200 acres, a mix of pasture land, carefully maintained buildings, and wild spaces where animals could recover in peace. James built Clara a proper clinic building where she could work more efficiently, with space for supplies and equipment and separate areas for different types of animals. Thompson, the ranch owner who had given James his start, eventually retired and sold his property to James at a generous price, recognizing the younger man's integrity and work ethic. With that acquisition, James and Clara became substantial landowners, respected members of the community, known for their fair dealings and their willingness to help neighbors in need. But despite their success and growing family, Clara and James never forgot what had brought them together. They kept the original pen that James had built for the baby Antelope, maintaining it carefully over the years. It became a symbol of sorts, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise celebration, inviting friends and neighbors from throughout the territory. As Clara looked around at the gathering, at the life she and James had built together, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She had gone from being a lonely woman convinced that solitude was safer than connection to being surrounded by family and community and love. James found her standing alone for a moment near the old pen, and he slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" He asked. "About how one small act of compassion can change everything," Clara said. "About how lucky I am that you decided to check on a dead doe in a ravine 20 years ago." "I am the lucky one," James said. "I found more than I ever dreamed of that day. I found home." They kissed, a gentle, familiar kiss that still held all the passion and promise of that first kiss on the porch so many years ago. Their children and grandchildren, because yes, Samuel had married and made them grandparents, called for them to rejoin the party, and they walked back hand in hand, ready to celebrate surrounded by the family and community they had built together. As the sun set that evening, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple, a small herd of antelope appeared on the ridge above the ranch. They stood silhouetted against the fading light for a long moment before bounding away into the gathering darkness. Clara watched them go, smiling, thinking about circles and completeness, and how the most unexpected moments could become the foundation for a lifetime of love. Samuel came to stand beside his mother, his own young son perched on his shoulders. "Do you think one of those could be the antelope from the story?" he asked. "The one that brought you and father together?" "Maybe," Clara said, knowing it was unlikely after so many years but preferring the poetry of the possibility. "Or maybe it is one of that antelope's children or grandchildren. Life continues, Samuel. The important thing is that we do what we can to protect it and nurture it whenever we get the chance." "That is what you and father taught us," Samuel said, "that every life matters. That compassion is never wasted." Clara squeezed her son's hand, proud of the man he had become, proud of all her children and the values they carried forward. James appeared at her other side, and together they watched the last light fade from the sky while their family celebrated around them. "No regrets?" James asked softly, echoing his question from so many years ago. "Not a single one," Clara answered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Years continued to pass in the beautiful, relentless way they do, bringing changes and challenges and joys. James and Clara grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces acquiring lines that spoke of years spent outdoors and years spent laughing. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming richer and more complex as they navigated the inevitable difficulties of life side by side. They faced droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns and personal losses. Friends passed away, and Clara and James attended more funerals than they cared to count. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. They had built their marriage on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection, and that foundation proved strong enough to weather any storm. Their children grew up and had children of their own, spreading across the territory, but always returning home for important occasions. The ranch became a gathering place for multiple generations, a place where family stories were told and retold, where traditions were maintained and new ones created. On their 30th anniversary, their children commissioned a painting of the ranch. The artist, a talented woman from Prescott, captured the property in meticulous detail, including the old pen near the barn where the baby antelope had recovered so many years ago. She presented it to James and Clara at a family dinner, and Clara cried when she saw it, overwhelmed by the beauty and thoughtfulness of the gift. "This is our legacy," James said that night as they prepared for bed, both of them looking at the painting that now hung over the fireplace in their bedroom. "Everything we built, everything we created together, it all started with you deciding to save a helpless creature and me deciding to help you do it. We make a good team," Clara said, a phrase she had repeated countless times over their decades together, but which never stopped being true. "The best team," James agreed, pulling her into his arms for a goodnight kiss. As they settled into bed, Clara listened to James's breathing deepen and slow as he fell asleep. She stayed awake a little longer, thinking about the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been so young when she found that fawn, though she had not felt young at the time. She had felt ancient, worn down by loss and loneliness. But James had helped her remember how to hope, how to trust, how to love without fear. The baby antelope had been the catalyst, but the love had been a choice they made every single day. A choice to be kind to each other, to support each other's dreams, to face challenges together rather than separately. That was what had made their marriage work, Clara realized. Not some grand romantic gesture or perfect compatibility, but the daily, deliberate choice to choose each other over and over again. When Clara was 59 years old, she fell ill with pneumonia. It was a serious bout, the kind that could easily be fatal for someone of her age in that time and place. James barely left her side, tending to her with the same gentle determination he had shown that baby Antelope so many years ago. Their children took turns sitting with her, and Rose, now a skilled healer in her own right, used every bit of knowledge she possessed to fight the infection ravaging her mother's lungs. For a week, the outcome was uncertain. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes delirious with fever. During one of her lucid moments, she found James holding her hand, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "You cannot leave me," he said, his voice breaking. "I am not ready. I will never be ready." "I am not going anywhere," Clara promised, squeezing his hand with what little strength she had. "We still have too much living to do," and she meant it. She fought the illness with the same fierce determination she brought to everything in her life, and slowly, incrementally, she began to improve. The fever broke, her breathing eased, and color returned to her face. It was another month before she was fully recovered, but recover she did, stubborn and resilient as always. James was even more attentive after her recovery, if such a thing were possible. He seemed to hold her a little tighter, kiss her a little more often, look at her with an intensity that spoke of how close he had come to losing her. Clara understood. She had seen that same fear in her own eyes when James had been thrown from a horse a few years earlier and broken several ribs. The reality of mortality became more pressing as they aged, but rather than making them fearful, it made them more determined to cherish every moment they had together. Their 40th anniversary was a grand affair, organized by their children and attended by what seemed like half the territory. The ranch was festooned with decorations, and there was enough food to feed an army. Clara wore a beautiful dress that Rose had commissioned from a seamstress in town, made of deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. James wore a new suit, looking distinguished and handsome even with his gray hair and weathered face. During the celebration, Samuel stood up to make a toast. "Most of you know the story of how my parents met," he began, and there were knowing chuckles from the crowd. The tale of the baby Antelope had become something of a local legend. But what you might not know is what that story taught all of us. My parents showed us that love is not just a feeling. It is a commitment to action, to showing up every day and doing the work of caring for someone else. They taught us that compassion and kindness are not weaknesses, but the greatest strengths a person can possess. He raised his glass. To James and Clara Holloway, who proved that the best love stories start with a simple act of caring and grow into something that changes not just 2 lives but generations of lives. May you have many more years together. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face. James leaned over and kissed her forehead, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "We did all right, didn't we?" he murmured. "We did better than all right," Clara whispered back. "We did extraordinary." As the years continued their inexorable march, James and Clara gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, leaving it in the capable hands of their children and grandchildren. They still helped out when they could, still took in the occasional injured animal, but mostly they allowed themselves to simply enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. They would take slow walks around the property in the evenings, pointing out changes and improvements, reminiscing about the early days when it had been just the 2 of them and a baby Antelope. They would sit on their porch, hands intertwined, watching their grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had played so many years before. On quiet nights, when it was just the 2 of them, they would tell each other the old stories, the memories they had accumulated over a lifetime together. The time Samuel fell in the creek and James had to fish him out. The year the drought was so bad they had to haul water from 10 miles away. The morning Rose delivered her first calf all by herself at age 12, beaming with pride. the countless small moments that had woven together to create the fabric of their shared life. James died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Clara lying beside him just as she had for nearly 45 years. She woke at dawn to find him still and quiet, his face relaxed and peaceful. The grief was enormous, a physical weight that threatened to crush her, but Clara faced it the same way she had faced every challenge in her life, with courage and the support of those who loved her. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the lives James and Clara had touched over the decades. Person after person stood up to share stories about James's kindness, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to family and community. Clara sat in the front row surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, taking comfort in the physical proof of the legacy she and James had created together. In the weeks and months after James's death, Clara found herself returning again and again to the old pen near the barn. It had been decades since it had housed the baby Antelope, but it remained standing, carefully maintained by the family as a memorial of sorts. Clara would sit on the fence rail and remember that young woman she had been, frightened and lonely, and convinced she was better off alone. She would remember the young man who had ridden up offering help, not knowing that he was offering so much more. She missed James with an intensity that sometimes took her breath away, but she did not regret a single moment of their life together. The joy had far outweighed the inevitable sorrow of loss. Love always involved risk, but it was a risk worth taking every single time. Clara lived for another 7 years after James died, remaining sharp and engaged with the world around her until the very end. She spent her final years surrounded by family, teaching her grandchildren and great-grandchildren everything she knew about healing animals and living with integrity. She told them stories about their grandfather, making sure they understood what a remarkable man he had been. On a bright morning in May, Clara passed away peacefully while sitting in her favorite chair on the porch, looking out at the land she and James had built into something enduring and meaningful. She was 84 years old, and she died knowing she had lived a full, rich, purposeful life. They buried her next to James on the hill overlooking the ranch, beside her father and other family members who had passed over the years. The funeral was another massive affair, celebrating a woman who had touched countless lives with her compassion and skill. At the gathering after the funeral, Clara's great-grandson, a boy of 14 named James after his great-grandfather, approached Samuel, now an old man himself. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did great-grandmother and great-grandfather really meet because of a baby antelope?" Samuel smiled, the same smile his father had worn, and nodded. "It is true. Your great-grandmother found a fawn that was dying, and your great-grandfather built it a pen and brought it fresh grass. And from that one act of compassion came all of this." He gestured to encompass the ranch, the family, the entire legacy that James and Clara had created. "That is a good story," young James said thoughtfully. "It is the best story," Samuel corrected, "because it is true and because it teaches the most important lesson there is. Love begins with choosing to care, even when it is difficult, even when the outcome is uncertain. Your great-grandparents understood that, and they lived it every single day of their lives together." The boy nodded solemnly, taking in the weight of his great-uncle's words. Around them, multiple generations of Holloways gathered, connected by the choices two people had made long ago to save a helpless creature, and then to save each other. The ranch continued to thrive long after Clara's death, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation that James and Clara had laid. The old pen remained standing for decades more, a physical reminder of where it all began, until eventually time and weather took their toll and it finally collapsed. But by then, the story had been told and retold so many times that the physical pen was no longer necessary. The memory of the baby Antelope, of Clara's compassion and James's help, of the love that had grown from that first meeting, lived on in the hearts and minds of everyone who came after. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, people would swear they saw antelope grazing on the ridge above the ranch, pausing to look down at the buildings, and people below before bounding away into the gathering darkness. Whether they were real or imagined, descendants of that original fawn or just wild creatures passing through, no one could say for certain, but it did not really matter. What mattered was the legacy of love and compassion that James and Clara Holloway had built together, starting with a dying fawn and a hastily constructed pen and fresh grass brought by a cowboy who was brave enough to care. That legacy lived on, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness could change everything, that love was always worth the risk, and that sometimes the best stories began with nothing more complicated than one person deciding to help, and another person brave enough to accept that help. The ranch still stands today, a thriving operation run by Clara and James's descendants, who continue to take in injured animals and treat them with the same care and compassion their great-great-grandparents showed to one frightened baby antelope more than a century ago. And in the family cemetery on the hill, 2 headstones stand side by side, marking the resting place of 2 people who proved that love built on kindness and mutual respect could last not just a lifetime but for generations to come. Their story had a perfect ending, the kind that only comes from 2 people choosing each other over and over again, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow, until death finally parted them. And even then, the love they had created continued on, rippling outward through time, touching lives they would never meet, inspiring others to their own acts of compassion and courage. It was, in every sense, a love story worth telling, worth remembering, worth honoring. And it all began with a baby antelope that needed saving and a cowboy brave enough to build a pen and bring fresh grass.